This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program, Living Legends Collection. This interview was originally conducted on the 1st of September, 1971. The interview is conducted by Mr. Pendleton Woods. The interviewee is Mr. Beryl Ford of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and that's capital B-E-R-Y-L, Ford. This material is being re-recorded on the 19th of June, 1986 for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener. The recorder is turned off and on a great deal throughout the original recording of this interview. When the recorder is turned back on, it makes a speeded up sound all the way through this interview. There is nothing we can do about that in the recopying of this material.
I'm interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. The date is September 1st, 1971. We're in Tulsa, the Tulsa County Historical Society, interviewing, and I am interviewing Mr. Beryl Ford. That is spelled, and I want to make sure that's correct, B-E-R-Y-L-F-O-R-D, Beryl Ford of Tulsa. Mr. Ford is in the contracting business, but he is also a collector of Tulsa memorabilia, pictures, and various other things that deal with Tulsa history. And we're going to be visiting with him about a little about the history and the dramatic story of Tulsa. And it will be a very informal interview in which we'll just be talking. And I think that to begin with, Beryl, why don't I ask you, one thing I think ought to be recorded is, and I'm sure you have the information, where did the name Tulsa come from? I understood, I've heard of the Tulsa town, you know, and such. Why don't you tell me a little about the background of the name of Tulsa? Can you do that?
All I can refer to is some of the research that have been done with other authors and researchers. The Tallahassee Indians, which were Creeks, had a word, the way they pronounced it, in regard to a town or teepee-type town or community or a cluster of teepees or tents, as we would call it from the pioneer standpoint, and it was pronounced similar to Tulsa, and really it was Tulsi. But it wasn't the S-E-Y additive, but it was the S-I. And that's as close as I can come from all the research that I've done and read of other people's research.
I'd heard of the term Tulsa town. Oh, was that a term ever used?
Oh, yes, never by what would be considered the elite. The elite, when I say elite, some of the merchants and people that were the powers that named it when they hung the sign up on the depot. It was Tulsa, T-U-L-S-A. Now, endearment, a term of endearment, you know, is add a E or something, honey or so on and so forth, but Tulsa town, they were always referring to going to Tulsa town. It was a pleasant place to come because the merchants were always receptive and interested in serving the people. So they would always refer to Tulsa, but it became more or less looked down upon if you used that terminology, as though you were not exactly the elite or the educated. And the uneducated usually mimicked and mocked phonetically what other people said, and if they said Tulsa, then they always called it Tulsa. I had a grandmother that called it Tulsa. She came from Gansden Indian Territory to Tulsa in 1915. She had heard about Tulsa town. And as much as I had learned in school and the pronunciation of Tulsa, she still called it Tulsa and not Tulsa.
Why don't you tell us how Tulsa began?
Well, overall, the research that I've done, one thing stands out. There was raw land awaiting here. There was a time clock of history just about to strike. And I would say that somewhere the powers that be that were the Frisco Railroad decided that to extend that railroad from Bonita to Tulsa. Now, Tulsa wasn't here to geographically extend it to this area. They came in this direction. There wasn't anything here. They knew that it was a path except for the path of the cattle drives and trails. They weren't interested in oil. They knew that oil was here. They knew there was other mineral resource. Basically, they were after the transportation of the cattle because there was huge grasslands here. When they arrived, they immediately set up a trading post. Then other people arrived to do business with mostly the construction crews. The project at that time was the bridge across the Arkansas River. Basically, the hesitation that existed here was the Arkansas River. If Frisco had decided to just come in this area and the river was not here, they would have plunged right ahead to a site that they really liked better in Sapulpa. But being the barrier of the Arkansas River, they had to hesitate and build that bridge. In the meantime, being it was the end of the line, which meant that you had to turn the trains around, you had to water them up in a certain amount of maintenance, then the people arrived to do those services, employees of the Frisco and then employees of the people that were setting up their merchandise stores, mainly a Mr. Hall and a Mr. Archer. The cattle business was already here. They immediately, in the surrounds, which they had been moving their cattle to Bonita, began bringing them here and setting up a cattle pen, which was located roughly around Boulder Avenue and the Frisco tracks, with another, that was for the cattle that came from the west, across the river and northwest of here. The cattle pens for the drives that came from the eastern areas of Tulsa set up their cattle pens near the area of Lewis and the Frisco crossing. These two combined cattle yards were the basic embarkation points for the cattle. The people that arrived on their cattle drives about 3 times a year would trade and buy and celebrate as they came to town. So naturally there began these flat-fronted buildings that were put up that were similar to the Last Chance Saloon, and some of them were houses of entertainment, others were general merchandise stores. Then commerce slowly developed from that point from 1882 until about the middle of the 1890s. Then it became kind of a distribution point for this general area in general merchandise. Oil was still undiscovered at that time, and other areas were being considered for their natural resource, the coal and such. We had coal nearby, but not in Tulsa as the city itself. The Arkansas River was the natural barrier to keep the railroad from commencing their construction and going across the river and southwestward. So naturally, Tulsa was the end of the line, you might say, and so consequently, people arrived here. If they came to Tulsa, they just came to Tulsa, wasn't going anywhere else, so they did have people coming in at all times. The people that arrived here and established themselves were very enthusiastic about the area, saw a great potential, not in oil or mineral or otherwise, but in farming and agriculture and cattle. They needed other railroads. They needed other railroads, and they wanted other railroads to come in. There was railroad construction going on all around them in the late 1890s. These enthusiastic gentlemen in Tulsa and the leaders and the businessmen decided that they were going to get some of those railroads to come to Tulsa. And the way they did this, they would contact the railroads and tell them about the attributes of the area. However, the railroads were cold and not too interested. They had their own destinations far beyond Tulsa that they wanted to arrive at. So the fellows in Tulsa decided that they'd put up a bounty. They got together as a group and voted upon the amount of money they would offer each railroad to locate in Tulsa. They would make these notes, signed notes among each other. They called them stud horse notes for $1,000 apiece. And let's just say they come up with $15,000 or 15 of these stud horse notes. They would present this to the engineer and the division manager of the railroad and say, look, you're going in our general direction, deviate your line over to Tulsa. Well, they reluctantly did. A lot of controversy developed. Some people lost jobs because of it, but they've never been sorry they arrived here. Now, 5 railroads crossed Tulsa at one time, some from the south and some from the north and from the southeast, but they were generally going southwest and northwest. Going on a little further, after the railroads arrived and oil was discovered, the big deal about oil at the time didn't blast too many headlines. Oil was known in Tulsa for some time, but the first bland well southwest of Tulsa had arrived and gushed out about 30 barrels to the hour. So that wasn't that was a historical point, but it wasn't anything to build an industry on at the time. The Glen Pool was the big change in the complexion of Tulsa from a cattle town and an agricultural center. Now it became an oil town. The boom was on. The people made and lost fortunes. Most of them made fortunes. But we still had our Arkansas River between us and our field of resource. Tulsa has been unique in all these years in this competition with the surrounding towns, that it has not had the benefit, and I say that with quotes, the benefit of governmental agencies, Indian agencies, missionary centers, and such as that. Tulsa has had free enterprise. So consequently, when there was a proposed bridge across the Arkansas River, it didn't behoove the citizens to run up a big bond issue or try to get a governmental agency to build them a bridge. I'm sure that this was requested by some people that were more politically minded than others, but the project was seized upon by 2 gentlemen. Those names escape me right now. And they built a bridge across the Arkansas River, an iron bridge. And they built it in a short period of time. So now we've bridged the Arkansas River, and commerce can freely move back and forth without having to ford the river on the barge or on wagon. They can go in any type of weather across the river. The pipelines begin to develop and come across the river, but they attach themselves to the bridges, which was another facility that could use the bridge. I got to get my breath again.
Oh, that's all right. Sure. You were telling me the gag that originated, you said, in Oklahoma City when referring back to the name of the town, which is a pretty good story in there. I'm sure there are lots of stories like that on all the towns, but why don't you tell me about that one?
Well, it involves the disputed origin of the name Tulsa. This Oklahoma City gentleman told a joke that he knows exactly where the name arrived at because his grandfather came to Tulsa via wagon, bringing some merchandise over to Tulsa, and suddenly he comes upon the river and he finds that there's a bridge instead of the usual traffic across the ford. So he gets on the bridge and drives across, and at the other end he meets this gentleman that says, "I'm the toll master," and he happened to be a very southern colonel that had been hired for the job, and this fellow says, "Tulsa." So that's where he thinks that the name Tulsa arrives.
Yeah. Well, it's just one of the anecdotes that comes from the naming and the background of any town. Do you have? Why don't we pick up? Let's see where we left off. We were talking about the. Do you remember where we were?
No.
You were checked here.
I've checked it, but I didn't have anything. I just checked them all.
No. We talked about the bridge.
I think we just got around the bridge.
Why don't we go beyond the bridge?
Well, I said I got to get my thoughts
Okay. Sure. Bill, what were the? You're talking about a period before any of the land openings, even before the run of '89. What were the conditions under which people were allowed to be here back prior to the opening of the lands?
Well, the white man and the primitive conditions that existed here was just a pioneer, and when he arrived, he stayed here. Let's see, he could. Can you step that way? The white man that arrived in the Indian Territory had never really settled. It had been more crossing and visiting than actually settlement until around 1882 here in the Tulsa area. Now, he was allowed to stay here and make his home and conduct a business on a commercial scale only at the pleasure of the Creek Indian chiefs, which they had councils and they had a kind of a democratic vote upon it. Now, there was also the Great White Father, which was the Indian agent that kind of oversaw the situation to make certain that there wasn't any illegal deals made with between the Indian and the white man that might be detrimental to the tribe as a whole. Now, the Creek Indians were able to rent these areas that the white man asked for. Now, when the white man set up his stores and homes in the Tulsa area near the Frisco Depot and tracks, he had to have the permission of the Creek chief of the area and ratified by the tribe. He paid a nominal fee per year, I would say in the neighborhood of $10 a year or $10 a year or something of that nature. The Cherokee Indian nation would not let the white man establish a home, a permanent home or a permanent dwelling unless he was intermarried with a Cherokee man or woman. And then he was able to conduct a business upon the basis of the rules and the laws of the Creek, of the Cherokee nation. But it was cumbersome because they had a different, they had a different treaty with the United States government and their nation, and so therefore you couldn't hold title in fee simple over there. And over here in the Creek territory, title could be taken in fee simple.
What were the boundaries there, generally speaking, between the Cherokee and the Creek in this area?
The Creek nation boundary, that would be their south boundary, followed Admiral Street. It came right down Admiral Street until it approached Denver in the intersection of about Edison. Then it turned north. It also was adjacent to the creek on the south and the Osage on the west. Now the Creek Nation would be that part south of Admiral and the southern area of Tulsa.
The Did this mean that the people who lived in Tulsa lived on one side of Tulsa rather than on the other because of the difference in tribal regulations on it? Generally, they lived in the creek area, I assume.
Yes, that meant that the area west of Lewis and south of Admiral developed much more quickly because the creek treaty and the way the creeks conducted themselves meant that the white man could simply tell the creek chief what he was doing, what he proposed to do, rent the land, and move right along without any interference or having to intermarry or put up with laws and treaties that they had with the United States government that might hinder them. So consequently, the creek part of the town grew a lot faster, and the original part of town is in the Creek Nation.
Why don't you talk about the first, where were you? Why don't we pick up where you left off, talking about the building of the first businesses, in particular the first permanent building. You mentioned the first two businesses.
Well, yes, the first businesses, as we stated a while ago, was flat-fronted, those last-chance saloon-type buildings, which were very temporary. Then as things moved right along, Tulsa, the residents of Tulsa having a great deal of pride and ambition to advance and a lot of enthusiasm in town, a fellow by the name of Robert E. Lynch, decided to build a brand new permanent type building of masonry. This masonry building was located on the southeast corner of 1st Street and Main. Mr. Lynch didn't have an architect, I presume. They more or less built from memory of other towns and other buildings, and probably a magazine-type picture, but he used all local materials. This stone was large sandstone slabs, approximately 12 inches thick and 4 to 6 feet long, and then and it was quarried out here by Catoosa, south of Catoosa, which is about a quarter of a mile north of the Frisco Railroad, which is between Catoosa and the Frisco Railroad, and they hauled it in on wagons. This was a two-story building. It was considered a permanent building, and it was the first permanent building in Tulsa. It was occupied by Mr. Lynch as a general merchandise store on the first floor, and the second floor was to be offices rented to local doctors and dentists and so on and so forth, but it wound up being more or less a town hall at that time. Other buildings next to it, the Tulsa Banking and the Price and Forsyth, Gillette and Price building were built a little later and were similarly constructed.
We have an interview, incidentally, with James Lynch, the son of Mr. Lynch.
Turn it off a minute. Which one? Downtown Tulsa at the time, it consisted of about 4 square blocks of downtown area, which meant that there was only about a dozen blocks of streets which consisted of just dirt paving, slightly graded out so that wagons and horse-drawn vehicles could navigate over them. They had the railroad pretty well graded out where they could cross. Cat Creek existed on the north side, which was only a wet weather type of stream with some holes of water during the dry weather. At first, this Cat Creek was used to load up the water for the steam engines that arrived in Tulsa, but later they drilled wells and pumped it to a large tank up top of a derrick. The streets were dirt, and as a little funny anecdote, a man asked a fellow one day why it was laid out with only 80 feet between buildings, which meant that it was rather narrow. The man said, "Why make it any larger? Because we just have to walk that much further in the mud." That's an old gag. So the streets were laid out, and the whole town site was laid out to parallel and at right angles to the existing railroad, which was not an east and west latitude bearing at all. It was slightly off to a northeast and a northwest southeast bearing for the Main Street. Main Street was the first street that was laid out. It was laid out as a line on the west boundary of it, which went right in front of Mr. Hall's store. The east boundary of it went right in front of Mr. Archer's store. Then First Street was named as the first street south of the railroad, Second Street and Third Street and so forth. Then when they named the streets north of the railroad, they started naming them First North, Second North, and Fourth North. When they named the North and South streets, they named it Main as the center. Then they named the streets that went east by alphabet according to towns east of Tulsa. And when they went west, they named the streets in the alphabetical order according to towns west of Tulsa. Naturally, as Tulsa grew very large, they ran out of names alphabetically and geographically, and they went into the East Avenue system and West Avenue system. Later, the streets on the north side were named after pioneer people, Archer and Brady, and there was a lot of other names that escape me right now that have since been taken off and new names put on to give more chronological order.
When were these streets settled and named?
The oldest naming and settling took place about 1902 at the time it was laid out, the town site laid out. I don't have all that in my head.
Well, that's all right. I mean, about
the boundaries. It was about a mile square. The town site was approximately a mile square.
When was this area open for settlement in the same manner that the other portions of territory were?
1882 was the beginning of Tulsa. The town site began to kind of develop. It was actually surveyed in that time, but not very well. It was resurveyed by Mr. Patton, and all these streets and everything named. Actually, in 1902, an act was passed for people in the Creek Nation of Indian Territory could actually buy, charter towns, municipalities, and actually buy and hold and sell the properties that in fee simple. I don't want to made myself clear.
In effect, it was about 1902 that they had the same privileges that those who settled the unassigned territories had in 1889.
Only in the chartered municipalities.
Oh.
That's quite legal.
I realize that. What about the right to own land? When did they gain that?
That was at the time. Only the white man could, if he was settled in a town, and the town could present itself to the territorial government and become a charter town and a municipality, then what they needed was taxes at the time. They'd grown kind of cumbersome, and with no way to tax and no way to finance their improvements. So they wanted to become a town. They asked for a charter from the territorial government. They were later granted that charter after some long drawn-out haggling. And they then could have it appraised. They had to be plus or minus, I believe it was $10 within the appraisal when they had it at public auction, you might say. But everybody kind of respected each other's rights because they didn't want too much competition on each and every parcel of land that they were occupying at the time, so everybody bid and they had a fair appraisal. That monies went to the funds for the tribe, which was the Creek Indian Nation. But that was in 1902 when this occurred.
Who was the first mayor of Tulsa? Do you remember these years?
Yes, Mr. Calkins.
Can you tell us anything about him, where his background was?
No.
I
could,
right.
That was refreshing.
Well, that's okay.
But that was not the commission form of government at the time. It was a strong mayor form of government, mayor council.
In the early part of the century, from your reading or knowledge of Tulsa history, who were the leaders who stand out prior to the oil development and that sort of thing? around the beginning of the century.
Mr. H.C. Hall and, stop that just a minute, and I can get there. Mr. H.C. Hall and Mr. J.M. Hall were probably the spark plug of at the beginning of Tulsa. They were early merchants, arrived here very early. They were associated with the Frisco. There was another gentleman by the name of Archer. One second, now I'll get his name. Mr. Archer was killed in an early accident in his business house, so he didn't get to participate in the, except in the very beginnings of Tulsa. One second a minute, let me get some names back in my head. In looking at my history books and pictures, a few names stand out in an early day as leaders in different fields. Mr. Hall stands out as an early day businessman and very much a civic leader. Mr. Archer was another early day businessman. Both of these gentlemen can take credit for being the earliest businessmen in Tulsa. But on down the lines in politics, Mr. Mowbray was a political man, and
Remember his first name? That's all right, go ahead.
Mr. Tate Brady was a businessman and politician, and Mr. Bynum was an early day businessman, about the third here, as I can figure. An engineer and surveyor, Mr. Patton, Mr. Forsyth, and Mr. Smiley were early day bankers. Mr. Forsyth was an early day banker in the Tulsa Banking Company. The Lynch brothers were businessmen. Then the Goodman, of the Dixon and Goodman people, were businessmen. There was a Dr. Kennedy, not the first doctor, but probably the one of the earliest and one of the best known and one of the most capable. And in religion, the earliest was the Presbyterian religion, of which Dr. Charles Kerr was probably the one that really brought it on from about 1900 and made it the church it is today.
Thinking in terms of buildings, we talked about those first buildings. Why don't we, and this may get us out of the time sequence, which is not too important. We can pull into that as we want, and subject sequences is important. What about the building of, say, as buildings began to grow up, what became the biggest building, and then what succeeded that as not necessarily... Thinking in terms of buildings, we talked about those first buildings. Why don't we, and this may get us out of the time sequence, which is not too important. We can pull into that as we want, and subject sequences is important. What about the building of, say, as buildings began to grow up, what became the biggest building, and then what succeeded that as not necessarily exactly, but what were some of the big buildings built, the first high-rise and that sort of thing?
Well, after the start of the permanent building in Tulsa, the first permanent building in Tulsa, which was at the First and Main Street location, the First National Bank Company, First National Bank, I guess it was a company, bought the Tulsa Banking Company enterprise out and moved to a new location in 1905, which was called the Skyscraper of Tulsa, a 5-story building at the corner of 2nd and Main. It had all the modern things of the day, the elevators and the water coolers on every floor, and many other things that was unique in those days. Then Tulsa moved, the geographic center and growth started moving to the south, right down Main Street. The next larger skyscraper, and it was touted in its day as a modern building, which it is even today. It has a lot of modern things. It was the Cosden building, which is later the Mid-Continent building. It's on the southeast corner of 4th and Boston. It was a 12-story building, which really towered above the 5-story buildings, plus it was on, geographically, the highest elevation in the old town side of Tulsa. So it had a magnificent view of the town and stood out from every angle as you arrived to Tulsa. Then along came the Bill Tower and surpassed it with this magnificent 22 or 23 stories, and it overshadowed the Colston building, which is now the Mid-Continent, and it was completed, and it was absolutely the latest and the greatest in architecture. Then along comes a year later, the Exchange National Bank, which is now the National Bank of Tulsa, and put up its 28 stories, mostly a tower, and it commanded the horizon of Tulsa, but not a great deal more than the Phil Tower building. Tulsa grew very steadily in all kinds of buildings in between those points I've mentioned, but at the beginning of the Great Depression, the skyline of Tulsa remained approximately the same. No more high-rise until after the Depression and after the war. And then after the war, it really came on. They started out with the number one construction of the first National Bank building at 5th and Boston, and that was the beginning of the new growth of Tulsa. And as we see it today, there's 42-story buildings commanding a horizon, which there's 48-story buildings being planned at this time. So as Tulsa has attained its magnificent profile, few people realize that as they look at the actual sites that these buildings stand upon, that this is not the first, nor the second, and nor the third, and sometimes it is the fourth use of the land. For instance, you take the corner of 4th and Boston, where our magnificent Home Federal Savings and Loan Building stands today. At one time, it happened to be just a residence or a backyard orchard of a residence in that block. Then it was the church, the home of the Presbyterian Church. And then it was demolished, and the Pioneer Telephone Company building put their headquarters building there. Then that was torn down, and now we have the Home Federal Savings and Loan Building, and all this has taken place within 60 years.
What about hotels?
And in regard to the accommodations for the people as they lived and built Tulsa, the early day hotels and accommodations were rather primitive. The earliest one was a hotel. Just a minute, I'll think of that. The early day hotel accommodations for Oklahoma, for Tulsa, was very primitive. Most of them based around the Frisco Depot, which was the Frisco Depot was located between 1st and Archer Street and the Main and Boston on the north side of the tracks. These hotels were only three at the time. The Alcorn Hotel was at 1st and Boston, and Moore's Hotel, which was a frame building, was between 1st and 2nd on Main, on the west side of the street. The hotel accommodations were primitive. They did not have running water at all. They didn't even have bathing accommodations. They had as I understand it, a metal bathtub that they loaned out as the individuals needed it, and they heated the water on the cook's stove in the kitchen and hustled it to you at a price. Then, as Tulsa grew and became more sophisticated, a gentleman by the name of Robinson built a hotel at the corner of 3rd and Main called the Robinson Hotel. It was a 4-story building, and it had all the modern conveniences of the day. It did have running water. However, the sewer drained right out in the alley in the rear because we didn't have sewer systems at the time. He later added a roof garden to the top of the building, which was a great place for entertainment in the day. Then the Tulsa Hotel was built in about 1911, and that made, I guess, the most radical departure from what we have had. It had everything. It had everything but what we call modern-day air conditioning. It had fans in the halls and in the rooms. It had elevators. It had hot and cold running water. And, of course, it had room service. And it had dining halls. It had all accommodations that was known at the time and was proclaimed a great advancement for the accommodations of people visiting Tulsa. Another hotel that came along and surpassed the Tulsa Hotel at the time in elegance was the Mayo Hotel. It was about 1924 when it was opened, and it was proclaimed one of the grandiose. Not only did it have all the modern conveniences, but it was done in very elegant taste with crystal ballrooms and gold striped and inlaid fixtures. Then as Tulsa grew, the hotel business has not declined or been in a slump, but the advance of the automobile brought on motels as we know them today.
What about disasters? We're thinking in terms of subjects. Now, what about the major disasters that have happened in the town of Tulsa, such as fires, such as you raised riots, such as other things that you might consider a disaster? Then we'll go to the good side. Maybe we should start with the good and the bad.
Well, I'll start with the bad. Sounds better. Everybody likes to hear the bad stories. The Indians has always said Tulsa was kind of protected by the gods and the elements because it's set on a hill and it had never been a tornado visit the area, and they don't think there ever will be a tornado visit the area. So far, up to my knowledge to this date, there has not been a tornado hit Tulsa in the form of the tornadoes we know. We had a windstorm here at one time, but everybody thought the devastation was caused by a tornado. But the Indians were superstitious about that, and it was part of their lore that they chose this area when they were driven here and brought here from the east, that this was the place that they should be because they will be protected from the elements and no windstorm shall hit the area. So far, this is held true. Now, catastrophes by act of man and the accident of man has overtaken Tulsa a time or two. We had one fire that destroyed the entire block of Main Street between 1st and 2nd on the east side. That happened in 1897 in the winter months. It started in a shoe store or a general merchandise store in a wooden frame building about the middle of the block, and it burned both ways. It burned down Turner's store, the Tulsa Meat Market, which was a well-known butcher, in the Price Gillette building, which housed a merchandise store in a community hall above, and the Tulsa Banking Company. It totally destroyed it in the building. It severely damaged the Lynch building. It was considered a catastrophe in those days with very little insurance involved to recover the monetary loss. But at that time, the entire loss was around $50,000 in merchandise and buildings. Another fire happened about 4 years later on the block, a corner of First and Boston. And the fire traveled mainly down First Street, which would be east of the alley, and from there to Boston. It wasn't quite as catastrophic a fire, but yet it did involve a bodily injury. A person was injured, and one was killed. The other fire did not result in anybody being injured or killed. In the early day in Tulsa, nobody had ever experienced such catastrophic fires. And, of course, we were ill prepared. We did have a fire department, a volunteer fire department, and they were ill-equipped. We did not have pressurized water systems as we know it today. They had a well. They had a pump, a hand-operated pump that they pumped the water up, and then they had a silk hose. They had 300 feet of inch-and-a-half silk hose that they imported from Japan. And they didn't have an organization other than just this group of volunteers. And the names of these volunteers escape me. But they had this fire, they had a small fire come up, and they were unable to combat it, and they lost the building, which brought to their attention that they were unorganized and that everybody wanted to play the chief. Seemed everybody wanted to grab the nozzle of the hose and point it, and nobody wanted to do the pumping, and that's exactly what happened, and that's exactly why the building burned down. But this was a lesson they learned, and they immediately set about electing a fire chief and organizing their volunteer department. The first fire chief that was organized was a Mr. Alder, A-L-D-E-R, again the first name. And he set about training the men. He had had some experience as a youth in firefighting, and organized the fire department and drew upon funds from what small city city government we had at the time, and they bought the equipment. Punch in. Punch in. Even though the
Start in and why don't we start in the first inkling that maybe there's oil here, and those things that you may know about the first discovery and up to Glenpool, those things within your area of knowledge.
The first indication that there was oil in the area of Tulsa was brought about by some investigation by Dr. Bland. And he and some others drilled what was known as Sue Bland No. 1 oil well in an area just north of Red Fork. They struck oil. It wasn't, it was a commercial well, all right, but it wasn't anything great or big, and they hauled the oil away at about the rate of 30 barrels a day on a wagon. There was other explorations around. They were all hitting shallow wells, and still it wasn't of great commercial interest. This Mr. Galbraith tried to convince several financiers and others that he had found oil in the area of Glenpool on Mr. Glenn's ranch. Very few people took note and heed of it. Everybody then was yelling, "I've got oil, come and see," and his words were taken very lightly. He finally arranges with a gentleman by the name of Chelsea, and they strike out to see what Mr. Galbraith is talking about. Mr. Galbraith actually takes them to this area, and as the story goes, literally drove a stake in the ground and pulled it out, and oil poured forth. Mr. Chelsea was more than convinced, with as much acclaim that Mr. Galbraith had gave the area in trying to tell everybody there was oil there. Mr. Chelsea was rather nervous of the fact that here is oil, and it's in such a profuse amount it even flows from the ground practically as an artesian. He was scared all the way back to town to start firming up his leases and protecting his area and his investment. But as a part of the times, so many people had screamed, "I've got all of my land, look here," and all kinds of promotions, which very few of them were valid. People just weren't listening. Anyhow, Mr. Galbraith and Mr. Chelsea developed the area, and it turned out to be, at that time and for about 10 years later, the largest oil reserve in the world. And that established Tulsa as the oil capital of the world. when you get oil from the ground, you have to do something with it. At that time, they lacked the pipelines, and there was no immediate refineries, and it all had to be transported out of Tulsa. A group of gentlemen got together and decided to build a refinery west of the river, just south of the entrance of the 11th Street Bridge, the west entrance, and they named it the Uncle Sam Refinery. It didn't altogether get off the ground even after it was nearly built because of financial difficulties or some such. But another company that had started nearly the same time but somewhat afterwards, by the name of Cosden, established a refinery and commenced producing refined products. And of course they shipped away from their refinery by rail, but they were immediately under construction many pipelines bringing the oil to the refinery instead of having to haul it by the wagon method. Most of it was coming directly from the Glen Pool. There was a Red Fork pool discovered somewhat later and developed much more later. Although the Red Fork was the first one discovered, the big discoveries were discovered later after they knew what sands, what stratus, and what geological formations they were dealing with.
Well, we might hit those three now. Tell us some of the names, the big names in the oil industry.
Some of the big names that have actually went out and explored for, drilled, and discovered oil, and then processed it and marketed it were Phillips, Sinclair, and Skelly. No, this one. No, this one.
Go ahead.
They were Waite and Frank Phillips, Harry Sinclair, and W.G. Skelly.
Did you know any of those three? Did you know Mr. Of course, you would not know, but did you know Mr. Skelly?
Yes, I knew Mr. Skelly only from a standoff position. I was president of the Young Republicans at one time, and I was rather scared because I was assigned to the Finance Committee, and we were asking for a donation for the Young Republicans. And I found him a very personable and compassionate person, an understanding person. I wasn't frozen by any means, but I was apprehensive about my approach, and he made it rather comfortable for me. He was not an easy man to convince. He told me when he donated, before he donated, that he wanted to know what our projects were. And I spent about 30 minutes relating what we had in mind and what we were going to do and how the money was to be used. And after he had listened to this, he was convinced that we had a worthwhile project, and he very graciously contributed.
Let's look at your notes again and see what areas back in your notes we ought to touch upon that you haven't.
We haven't got into diversification, but
okay.
Just about the growth of the repression personalities. We kind of hit a little bit on that.
How about land use?
With 3 or 4 different uses, we've already kind of.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
And then I was going to sum it up by saying that most of my information is gleaned from books and pictures, and I consider my pictures then as a frozen history, just a view backwards.
Why don't you have the best private local history collection of pictures I've ever seen. Well, tell us how you got involved in saving pictures. I mean, where did this begin? Did your interest in history begin with pictures, or did your interest in the pictures begin with history?
Well, I was known and proclaimed as probably the worst history student that existed from the 6th grade on. But that's a different story altogether. In 1950, I collected stamps. And as I collected these stamps, I discovered that postmarks on postcards and stamps on postcards were rather interesting. And by looking to the reverse side of these postmarks on the postcards, I found these pictures. I began to see that there was a few pictures in my postcards in my collection that had pictures of Tulsa in its early day and Indian Territory days. And I became engrossed with them, and I finally decided there must be more, and so I searched and researched and found more and more picture postcards. And after seeing the different postcards and the names of the photographers at the bottom of these postcards, I also recognized them as local men. I decided that there must be somewhere some of these pictures in existence or some of these negatives that these gentlemen had still around. And lo and behold, after a great deal of research and a lot of ins and outs, I did arrive at finding a few at a time. And as I grew more and more familiar with the pictures, they began to tell me of the general growth by lining them in chronological order. I could see the general growth of Tulsa. Then I began to become fascinated with the growth of Tulsa and the history of Tulsa. And so that was the beginning of my collection, which now consists of about 6,000 pictures of Tulsa, of which about 2,000 are scenes along the streets in Indian Territory days.
You still collect stamps?
No, I gave the stamp collection up. This was just a much more fascinating and rewarding to me hobby.
You describe your pictures as windows of history. Why don't you elaborate a little on that?
Well, when you look at a picture, especially one, well, any one, it was taken today or was taken 1 minute ago, it has frozen that subject and recorded it for posterity. Well, that's all kind of high-minded type of relating, but you just take a postcard and call it a window, or a picture and call it a window of frozen history. You can look at it today, you can look at the one that precedes it, or the one after, and you go back tomorrow and look again. It's just frozen history, windows of frozen history. I don't say that well.
Yes, that well. The idea is very good. Do you have any other thoughts that you can think of that I should have asked or that you had not put in there?
I can't think of anything.
This is excellent, really, very, very good.
I hope it turns out good.
Out of it, I will. In other words,
This has been an interview in Tulsa on September 1st, 1971 with Beryl Ford, whose collection of stamps, which led to the collection of pictures, has ended up in his tremendous interest in the development of history in Tulsa. Thank you very much, Mr. Ford.